Everybody, the theme of this week is appropriation, and I want to give you a case study this week that I'd like you to consider. The case study is to do with a request by a group of Torres Strait Islanders, one of Australia's two Indigenous peoples, a request that they made of the British Museum to return two skulls that were in the British Museum's possession and that had come from Torres Strait in the late 1880s. This is really appropriate for this week, right on the topic of appropriation and issues to do with how Indigenous people would like things that have been taken from them to come back to them. And it also shows how an anthropologist can be involved in real world issues, bringing the sorts of knowledge that you're learning about in a unit like this to bear on real world problems. An anthropologist is me, so I'm able to speak with some, intimate knowledge of it, and hopefully it allows you to ask questions of me in the lectures and the tutorials and even on the discussion forum as well. So what I would like you to do is make sure that you've listened to what I'm about to tell you, the case study, watch the lecture, do your readings, and then respond to the case study and in the discussion forum, and let's see if we can generate a discussion in the discussion forum around issues of appropriation and repatriation. Okay, let me give you a bit of background to this. In 2011, a group of the Torres Strait Islander Repatriation Working Group wrote to the British Museum and asked them to return two skulls that were in their collection. Those two skulls came from Torres Strait in the late 1880s. British Museum often gets requests from people around the world asking them to return objects or human remains that have had their source in another part of the world. Museum's a collecting institution, and so it houses a lot of things from around the world. Some of you have probably been there yourself, or at least you've been to a museum, so you know what museums are like. Because the museum gets a lot of these sorts of requests, it has a series of processes in place. In this case, the process was to ask two people for advice or information on the skulls. And the two people were a social and cultural anthropologist with knowledge of Torres Strait Islanders, and that person was me. That's one of my ethnographic areas of research. And a forensic anthropologist, a person who has expertise in the study of human remains. Okay, so a little bit of background. In the 1880s, a marine scientist who worked with marine invertebrates, jellyfish, sea anemones, kind of squiggly things like that, was in Torres Strait, and he asked if he could purchase skulls from Torres Strait Islanders. I know that kind of sounds really creepy, like I can't imagine ever ask, and I'm sure you are unlikely to in your life, or you certainly probably haven't done it up to now, you ask someone, do you mind if I just buy bones of one of your relatives, deceased relatives? That kind of sounds a really not cool thing to do, but its context is everything. Excuse me. In the 1880s, at the time Alfred Court Haddon, the marine scientist, was in Torres Strait, Torres Strait Islanders treated skulls in some really interesting ways. They don't actually treat skulls in the same way as now, but they did then. Important things to know. When a loved one died, say a young child, a brother, or someone close to you, after the body had decomposed, they would take the skull and they would apply makeup to it, hair, wax to replicate a nose, tints for the lips, more wax on the eyebrows, hair from various animals onto the head, and they would keep the skull in that kind of dressed up, made up way in their house. And as an islander said to Haddon at the time, for us, skulls are like photographs. You guys have photographs of loved ones you put on the wall. We know that we carry around with you. We know that. But we don't have cameras, so we dress up skulls of our loved ones and keep them with us to keep our connection and our love for them going. The other thing was that where they didn't keep skulls, they would collect them into particular areas in a village. These were collected on the basis of clan membership. So when a person died, if someone didn't have enough space or they didn't want to dress up the skull, they would put the skull in an area like a small little hut where all the skulls of members of a particular clan were kept. The other thing to know is that at the time Torres Strait Islanders were trading skulls along with other objects with each other. So they were like items of wealth. So when Haddon asked for skulls, he could see them around the village space, and he knew that they were being traded amongst between Torres Strait Islanders and other Torres Strait Islanders, and he knew that they were in houses. So they were kind of quite visible things, and really treated very differently to the way you and I would treat a real skull, particularly of a loved one. Anyway, he bought 2 skulls. He traded rope, materials, clothing materials, fabrics, and a bunch of other things. Then he writes some notes in his diaries, and he says that the way he describes it is a fairly open, free transaction. It doesn't sound like that the islanders were put under duress, and I think we have to take Haddon's own words at face value. Okay, so we fast forward to the present, and contemporary Torres Strait Islanders want these remains returned. In fact, this Torres Strait Islander Repatriation Working Group has been taking directions from Torres Strait Islanders all over Torres Strait, and they have told them they want human remains of their ancestors anywhere that are kept in any institution around the world. They want them back in Torres Strait. Anyway, the British Museum asked me to write a report explaining the significance of skulls to Torres Strait Islanders. They gave me 2 ways they wanted information about that. One was the social and cultural significance at the time that Haddon got these skulls in the late 1880s, and the social and cultural significance of skulls for contemporary islanders at the present. So I told them much of what I've told you already about how islanders traded skulls, and I also told them about how it was really important to islanders to have the return of human remains to them for a number of reasons. 1, they wanted to have appropriate burials for them. 2, they found it very demeaning to have human remains in other institutions where they were done research on or displayed for public view. Even if they weren't, they just wanted those to be returned to them, and so forth. A number of institutions around the world have agreed to requests by Torres Strait Islanders and other Indigenous groups, but on this occasion, the British Museum didn't. They felt that Haddon had bought these skulls fairly and squarely, if you like. He hadn't stolen them. He hadn't pressured anyone to give them to them. He hadn't done anything ethically or morally inappropriate by digging up human remains. He had asked for 2 skulls. They had been delivered to them. He'd paid for them, and then he gave them to the museum. And so the museum said they don't really have a responsibility to return them. They're theirs. They own them. They weren't gotten in an inappropriate way. They ignored the part of the report where I talked about wanting appropriate burial, how they were very important to contemporary islanders, how they felt very demeaned by having the remains of their ancestors on display or in institutions around the world. They didn't feel this was like a very compelling argument. Okay, what I want you to do now is consider this case study, and consider the following question and post a response in the discussion forum. Is the British Museum obliged to return ancestral human remains to Torres Strait Islanders? Depending on your response, yes or no, you need to justify why you think they should or they shouldn't. Post that discussion forum, read others' other responses, and engage in a discussion with each other. You can ask me questions. I'll do my best to information, particularly about the case study, not so much about issues to do with appropriation more generally. That's where I want you to do your thinking. But if there's any particular details about the case study, if I can answer that, I will. And what I'll do is, after the end of the week, I will close down the discussion forum and I'll read through all of your posts and try and summarize the main points and give them as feedback to you. Okay, thank you very much.